I would like to thank the Diocese of London, Reverend Malcolm, and the Church Wardens of St Mary Abchurch for the opportunity to speak in this wonderful Christopher Wren building. This venue is the most appropriate of all the places in London we could talk about the matters that I would like to talk about with you today. And the reason for that will become clear as this lecture develops. Malcolm very kindly introduced me. I don't need to run over the same ground, but my credentials to handle some of these things are occupying the house of Sir Rowland Hill in Shropshire, Soulton Hall. He had a mansion here in London as well, which is now lost, but is interconnected with the Mercer's Company on Cheapside. And he also, as we will see, was a European figure who had accommodation on the European continent and controlled the Rhine fleet. And we are going to pick up lost aspects of his reputation and achievements as this lecture goes on today. The other thing I want to cover before we get underway formally with the meat and bones of this lecture is, very importantly, I have to pay proper respect to other scholars who have given me support to get to the point where these matters can be put in front of you today. There are 5 people who have contributed to this work. The most important, James Wen, who is a country house expert and consultant that my family have retained for 2.5 years to work on these matters. And there's mathematics and other freight in here that I am not going to engage with, but I will signpost you to the Bürgergenicht Limited website, which is handling that stuff. Additionally, Christine Schmiedel, who I met this morning but is not still in London, who has helped me a lot with the Shakespeare aspects of this. And then James Charette and Ed Thompson have also been very important. The lecture contains a number of animations, which I'm incredibly grateful to James Charette for doing. This is an animation of the building we're fortunate to be talking in today. I want you to particularly be aware that we are in a brick cube of 55 feet by 55 feet, that we have a pyramidal roof above us, and that outside we have an 8-pointed star pavement. All of this work that Wren did, but it is important to understand that the designs that Wren had put forward for this church after the Great Fire were departed from on the insisting of the Fellows of Corpus, Cambridge. And there are reasons for that we will come to. The materials that advertise this lecture lent on connections with William Shakespeare, which will be spoken into the record for the first time at this lecture today. Specifically, the play As You Like It. Mostly people are familiar with As You Like It as a love story, and it's a confusing play that sometimes people have not rated as some of Shakespeare's best work. And I think I want to call your attention to a political story that exists inside the play. The court has a usurping duke, Duke Frederick, who has taken over the court, and the good statesmen have had to leave to go to the forest of Arden, where they are studying philosophy and having a good time. But the country is a mess. Good people go to the countryside to study, to think about philosophy, and to find harmony, which they do, and then they take that back and fix the country. And I think it's important to hold in your minds that that can map fairly well onto the political landscape of Tudor England in the 16th century, where the Reformation has caused 300 Protestants to be killed for their faith, and it is about to cause 190 Catholics to be killed for their faith. In the play, we have a senior figure who is dead for the entire action of the play, but he's referred to repeatedly during the play in Act 1, Scene 1, and he's still being referred to in the final scene of the final act, and that is Old Sir Rowland de Boyce of the Forest. He's the father of Orlando, of Oliver, and Jaques, and he is frequently invoked as a model of virtue in the play. And if you're inside the machine of my family and familiar with the work of the man I'm going to put before you today, you get to a point where you write in your A-level text, is this Rowland Hill? So, Shakespeare has a Rowland Hill, and the real world we inhabit had a Rowland Hill in the 16th century. The slide has a monument to him, which is generated in the 18th century. which says, to suffer such a character to sink into oblivion would be in the highest degree ungrateful, as well as injurious to posterity, for whose imitation it is held up. But before this lecture was calendared, I suspect many people weren't familiar with the legacy of Rowland Hill. And there are a number of reasons why this happened that we need to inhabit. Because he was a singularly important 16th century statesman, theologian, polymath, and all-round supporter of culture. And his record has been overwritten for several reasons. One is that there are other people in subsequent generations who end up holding the name Rowland Hill, who shout louder to our ears now. Rowland Hill, who invents the post office, Rowland Hill, who's second in command at the Battle of Waterloo, and a Rowland Hill who's a radical preacher and vaccine pioneer. So we have to hear past those voices to get to Rowland Hill. But there is a stronger reason why Rowland Hill has been forgotten, is that his legacy is problematic for English statecraft. The work he was doing was securing a settlement of harmony out of the chaos and iconoclasm and danger of the 16th century. And the most important part of that, which we aren't familiar with now for excellent reasons, is the publication of the Geneva Bible, which in its time heralded the Renaissance and created a pause in the danger of the 16th century. But by the time you get to the 17th century, this Bible is carried by the forces of Oliver Cromwell, and it is part of the authority for the execution of Charles I, and is also taken on the Mayflower by the American first settlers, and it is part of the authority for the Declaration of Independence by the American people. So if you go to the Bible Belt in America now and ask about senior 16th century Bibles, they will all say the Geneva Bible. But in this country, because of what happened to our statecraft, the execution of a king, the Declaration of Independence from these people in America, this book had to be put to one side and slightly overwritten. Had that not happened, I would have to do less work in this lecture to reassure you that Rowland Hill is really important. But he's a great father of this city. He still has charities that run in his name in Shropshire and here in London, and his portrait still occupies a senior place in the livery hall of the Mercers. I am putting a reasonable amount of weight onto this dance. This dance, which is outside this building and for reasons we'll see in Shropshire also, is a learning technology to hold information. And it talks about the duties of Plato's guardians, what a harmonious society looks like. This dance has been part of human culture, reaching back to Persia 6,000 years ago, to the antiquity of Greece in Eleusis, very important to Renaissance people. And it has 8 people in it. So I need to look with you today at 8 characteristics of Rowland Hill. And to make it easy for all of us, I'm going to say there are 8 types of character dancing in Rowland Hill. Rowland Hill as a statesman. I made reference to this already, but we need to get into a bit more detail. So he is a merchant, and he isn't in a sort of second or third order merchant. He is controlling a significant proportion of the national debt, and he controls the Rhine fleet. The state papers from the 16th century talking about Rowland Hill call him the great occupier of Germany for the purposes of trade. He suffers an attack by pirates, which is so serious that the King of France and Scotland is involved. Cromwell is sending letters, and everybody is desperately trying. I suspect this money never turned up, but it's turned into some rather nice houses in Antwerp. We don't quite know. But the subtlety of his statecraft is a thing that I want to cover next. Rowland Hill serves on the Privy Council all the way through from Henry VIII, Edward VI, Queen Mary, and Elizabeth. There's a short period of disfavour under Mary for obvious reasons because of his Protestant sympathies. But as a statesman, he has got a ringside seat for all of this period, and that's unusual. The difficulty about the Renaissance or the Reformation periods is that when you have the Catholic Church as an organization warehousing what I will call civics, it is very clear that we do need to make provision for the needy, which is doles to the poor. We need to run a health system. We need to provide education. The shock of the Reformation is that there are different forces working in the culture of England at that time. And some people are ransacking and pillaging the state, and some people are sensitive to the fact that we need to reset the example that those things are done. Rowland Hill founds a school. He refounds every hospital in London and is president of Bridewell and so on. He does public works in building causeways, he restores churches, he builds bridges, which is why I put this quotation in front of you on the next slide. This is a contemporary account from 6 years after the death of Rowland Hill. This Sir Rowland Hill, to the great praise of his vocation and the charitable deeds done by Sir Rowland Hill, singular comfort of the public weal of his country, erected many notable monuments and good deeds, which were long here to write. Wherefore, I refer them to my summary. And I can't refer you to a summary, but I'm just going to tell you to go read Wikipedia because they're listed there, and it is endless. I've touched on Sir Rowland Hill's work as a publisher. I have only cited to you one book that he published, which was of immense importance. The first time that the Bible is available in large volumes for ordinary people to buy, it is the Geneva Bible, which is enough of a public achievement in publishing for us to regard this as an important individual. But it is not, by any means, the end of what he does. He publishes books on mathematics. So there is a game not familiar to us called Rithmamachia, and he publishes what I think is still the leading text on Rithmamachia, even now in 2024, partly because no one plays this game, because you need to know about arithmetic progression before you can win, and also what winning looks like depends on how you're going to use maths. It is an incredibly nerdy game. And if we leave mathematics to one side, he publishes on the history of Turkey, the discovery of Florida. He publishes on theology. He publishes on statecraft. He publishes on medicine, which is what this rather gory image here, certain works of surgery never compiled and published. That's him. But this is a man who is interested in civic works, interested in hospitals, interested in the welfare of ordinary people and how to have a country that is harmonious. The quotation on the screen there is from the 1560 Geneva Bible that Rowland Hill publishes, and I want to underline for you how dangerous that work was. So it says in the epistle to the reader, "The translating of the Holy Scriptures into our native tongue required greatly to be pursued, though the time then was most dangerous and the persecution sharp and furious." 300 people died for their faith, but which brings me to the work that Rowland Hill did. So we're going to deal with Rowland Hill as an architect. So a learning perspective I want you to adopt for this lecture is that buildings are capable of being documents that can hold information that we can read, and that shouldn't shock us. So, very excitingly, for the first time ever, I'm going to show you animations of Soulton Hall, accurately reconstructed on the basis of 2.5 years of work from James Wen, who is in the room, which shows you Rowland Hill's house as he conceived of it. There is a slide which shows you a sort of hybrid of phases coming up, but you're looking at a mega maths castle from a complete nerd. Every idea he has come across, he has put into this building. And one way of thinking about this building is a USB stick created in emergency by statesmen who've had to run away from London because they are out of favor and their friends are being killed for their faith, to talk about the statecraft they are doing and leave us a way of recovering information in a time of emergency. In the lane of biblical allusions, you see a pyramidal roof, which is conjuring the Holy Sepulchre. On this elevation that you can see now, you see two tower-like projections, which is conjuring Solomon's Temple. It is obviously a chivalric building. We have crenellations. We're slightly invoking a sense of Avalon and King Arthur. And actually, where I live in Shropshire is thickly planted with legends about King Arthur. Guinevere is supposed to have come from Oswestry. Uriconium, Roxeter, potentially is where Camelot was. These are things that Rowland Hill would have known. I know it, it's in the culture from where I live. Now, turning specifically to classical allusions, there are two, well, there's more than two. There's an allusion to the Well of Catharsis somewhere in the grounds, down an avenue, which is from, I will pause this elevation. Those gates open, they're aligned with the rising of the sun on Easter morning. The central window on the only symmetrical face is where the chapel is in the house. Looking at this, you have a precinct that is 55 yards by 55 yards, which is exactly the same as the footprint of the Telestrion out in Eleusis. Eleusis is a short distance outside Athens, where the senior Greek mysteries of ancient times were done. These are so important that Cicero goes, Plato goes, Alexander the Great goes. They run for a couple of thousand years. And in 16th century England, they are very famous and important. And Rowland Hill has measured this building and put it into his building. So we have a Greek temple to the most important Greek mysteries. And those mysteries were so important that all these senior people were going, but also there were some rules. You could only go once. You couldn't say what you had seen there, and if you did, you'd be killed. So we're dealing with something of incredible high importance to ancient culture, and that is baked into this design in 1560. We have also got two tower-like projections which come behind the house, and James will do more on this, but it is enough to argue from authority that this is invoking Epidaurus, which is where Hippocrates practices medicine, so we have a hospital. But hospitals and theatres are the same thing in classical antiquity. So we have a Tudor statesman who, for reasons I'm going to show you, is involved in drama, building a theatre whose completion date is prior to 1560. If you read the books at the moment, no theatres exist in England from the fall of the Roman Empire to 1570. But Peter Ackroyd says there's a lost pattern, and there is potentially a solution on this building in Shropshire. And that has not been said before. But when you have the building properly reconstructed, the idea that you've stacked all these ideas in a building is more easy to accept than when you look at Soulton Hall as it has come down to us today. 500 years is a very long time. The pyramidal roof has gone. Changes are made, which I think we can say with some confidence are the work of Christopher Wren. This is the house as we have it now. So that is Soulton Hall as you have it now. But I want to pause this, if I can do it well, here. You can see an 8-pointed pavement, which we have here. So we have a brick box in Shropshire built by a statesman in the 1560s, and outside a pavement. And we say, confidently, that that is the lost choreography of a dance. It's exactly the same as the one we have outside here. So here we are in a brick cube of 55 foot by 55 foot with an 8-pointed star outside. It is related to a building that we say Wren worked on that is the same dimensions and has another pavement. And that one, because it shows you on the Soulton Hall stamp, you will see that there are different numbers of lines between the different places in that pavement. It is showing you the do-si-do and the box step into the middle. We have the recovered music as well. I want you to bear in mind at the end of As You Like It, there is a dance for 8 people, and they're in a forest setting in Shropshire. Before we depart from this section, I want to just do a little plug for Shropshire and the work of John Weaver, who is the father of English ballet and also the father of pantomime. He's teaching he's teaching these arts at Shrewsbury School in the late 1700s. And his papers include work by Ptolemy's harmonics, which if you take Ptolemy and put it next to this dancing pavement, you get the same thing. So this idea, which I asked you to hold at the beginning of the lecture, that dance could be created holding sacred meaning, is embedded in these dances. And I can go further than that because he writes an essay called An Essay towards an history of dancing. And in that he says, it is well known that our councillors and judges at diverse times will dance as part of the ministry of holding those public offices. The last thing I need to do before we leave this section is, my copy of Arden Shakespeare, I have a bone to pick with, because as I've told you, my copy here includes a 17-year-old Tim Ashton wondering whether Rowland Hill and Roland de Boyce and As You Like It are the same person. And I read the introductory notes, and we have what has come down to us of a sense of the scope of territory occupied by the Forest of Arden is a small area from Henley in Arden to Stratford. And that is not what an early modern or Tudor head heard when they heard the Forest of Arden described. The Arden family are in West Bromwich, and this that is on the screen is from the Gough map, which is 1300s map. It shows Arden in the box and includes Birmingham in it. So the territory of the Forest of Arden is not just Warwickshire, and that is wrong, and it's been compounded by people like cross-referencing wrong citations. And a better definition of the Forest of Arden is that area of England that isn't served by roads from the Romans, which gives you a boundary to the north of Watling Street, the A5 that runs through Shrewsbury, the Fosse Way, Salt Way, and the Welsh border. So Rowland Hill's house, where there are sermons in stone, is not quite in the Forest of Arden, but it is really only about 8 miles to the Forest of Arden, and you've got to hack through it to get to his house. So Roland de Boyce of the Forest, Rowland Hill, Forest of Arden, these themes fold into a sense that the play, in talking about Roland de Boyce in the Forest of Arden, is quite happily occupying the idea that we're talking about Rowland Hill. And I think a 16th century audience would have appreciated it that way. The next identity of Rowland Hill I want to bring you to is that of a protector of art and artifacts. I don't know whether anybody from the Mercers is here today, but I'm very grateful for their support. There is a photograph of the Corpus Christi statue in the Mercers Chapel, which is a few streets from here. This is buried in the 1540s, 50s, because this statue is subject to persecution from iconoclasm. Rowland Hill's mansion, as I've already told you, physically interconnects with the Mercers, and he is master of the Mercers more than anybody else has ever been. This is buried under the floor of their chapel. We only have it now because a bomb went off at the Mercers, destroyed the building, and in the 1950s of the reconstruction phase, they went through, found a sort of socket of sand, and at the bottom of it, this extraordinary statue. It's an exquisitely beautiful statue. So Rowland Hill, and this happens cannot possibly happen without Rowland Hill's knowledge. So we have a man who has form for protecting artifacts and cares about culture. We can also see parts of his personality in his mayor-making when the 16th century custom, which dies with the Reformation, is that the Lord Mayor on Lord Mayor's Day goes to St. Paul's Cathedral and does a procession, which ends at the shrine of Erkenwald, now lost. And Rowland Hill walks through not a cathedral that is in a good health, but one that has been pillaged by Somerset and others for its art treasures and for its building materials. A whole cloister has been smashed to bits. And Rowland Hill is a humane and sensitive person who, while he has Protestant sensibilities, cares about culture. And what comes down to us from the ages is that he does a De Profundis oration at the tomb of St. Erkenwald, looking at this desolation. Likewise, the second thing on this slide is Rowland Hill's statue in Hawkstone in Shropshire, where he is holding a copy of Magna Carta. We've lost the original Rowland Hill monument. That was in St. Stephen's Walbrook, a short distance from here. The Great Fire took that, but we know from contemporary accounts he was holding Magna Carta in that. And I want to bring your attention to the fact that Rowland Hill was protecting texts. We can see this because in the reign of Mary, despite being a Protestant, he has the right and the powers to seize prohibited texts. This power continues to exist inside him under Elizabeth. So he is unique in having the right to hold prohibited books. And it has been put into the public domain that it is conceivable that the Parker collection in Cambridge, alongside the Cotton collection, in the Parker collection, largely all of it would have had to have had Rowland Hill's protection to come down to us safely. That includes St. Augustine's Gospels just used in His Majesty's coronation. And the Cotton collection, these are state papers, a lot of them are mercantile. The Cotton family were working for Rowland Hill as estate factors in Shropshire for him. So we have a personality that we can see his sensibilities around art. And this is not trivial if you're William Shakespeare, who you're quoting a Bible with Rowland Hill's name on it 1,000 times, and you adore culture, and there is a person who is inhabiting this kind of cultural guardian role for the whole country. And this is a known thing because 2 blocks from here you could see his statue holding Magna Carta. Magna Carta in the 16th century is an incredibly important vessel for advancing English liberty. Now we turn to the fifth identity of Rowland Hill. I'm afraid there's a picture of me on the screen because there's a priest hide in Soulton Hall. What on earth are we doing with a priest hide in a house of a senior Protestant? For the longest time, my family were actually not prepared to accept that we had a priest hide because these are for hiding Catholics and the credentials are very, very Protestant. But we forget about this period of persecution I called your attention to. And there was a time when we had to hide people as well as documents and art treasures and sculptures. And this is a very important feature in Soulton Hall for underlining the fact that we have a man who is protecting art. The accompanying image there is a 15th century image of the Ark, and I want you to think about that as being an identity that Rowland Hill put into his house, that people, objects, artifacts were being taken there for protection. And if you think about the amount of money that Henry VIII owes him, the remoteness of Shropshire, the fact he's a Privy Councillor, there are few people that could get England from the mess it was in to the Renaissance it had without a civil war, and that's incredibly obscure work that was necessarily secret. But anyway, the first priest hide in England, and very exceptional because it's for hiding Protestants. But a clue into the character of the man who's the subject of today's lecture. Coming closer to William Shakespeare now, we have to deal with the identity of Rowland Hill as someone who actually patronizes art rather than merely consuming and protecting it. The image on the screen is the Lord Mayor's Show. In the 16th century, they had really wonderful pageantry for the Midsummer Watch, which is the grandparent of the celebrations that London knows so well today. And these became so extravagant and ridiculous and elaborate that they were stopped by royal command because they kept bankrupting the Lord Mayors of London. Rowland Hill and his friend Thomas Gresham decided that despite this prohibition, they would like to recover this. And history shows us that these are essentially plays, and they're also an expression of statecraft. They are also like an economic and fiscal stimulus to a people who have, economic challenge, which is well understood to be an issue in Shakespeare's time and the generation before. Rowland Hill's commissioning art with like 9,000 people in the cast, in bright harnish, watching them definitively as a matter of record with King Henry VIII and Jane Seymour at the loggia of the Mercer's Chapel. So they're going down Cheapside. 9,000 people in a play. Is he an arts commissioner? Yes, he is. Does this come down to Shakespeare? I say it does. And there's also an expression of this in Shropshire, where Rowland Hill commissions and funds art in the St. Catherine's Fair. So the records are there for him doing it in Shropshire and in his native Shropshire and here in London. But Shakespeare's not going to not know about someone who revived a thing that employed his people, actors, costume people. We now need to come to biographical history. So I was finally able to get access to St. Stoke-on-Tern Church in Shropshire, near Hodnet, where William Hill, brother to Rowland Hill, was the rector. I was finally able to see a monument there to Reginald Corbett and his wife, Alice Greatwood. They have a daughter, Elizabeth, who marries Robert Arden, the son of Edward Arden. That makes an alliance between Rowland Hill's heir in that line by second cousinhood to William Shakespeare's mother. So Rowland Hill is by marriage a cousin of William Shakespeare. More than that, the Arden family have had a bit of a nightmare because they've been implicated in a plot and are Catholics, needing to recover their status. But Shakespeare, does he know that his mum's second cousin married the heiress of the publisher of the Geneva Bible and one of the richest commoners in England? He does know that. So if you say Old Sir Rowland to William Shakespeare, you invoke this identity. The next identity I want to bring your mind to is the de Vaux dynasty. Now, I'm going to have to be very careful about the numbers of elders. So we're talking here about the second Earl of Essex. The connection here is not by family, apart from the last slide where we talk about the Vernons, and there it's a bit remote anyway, but the education of the second Earl of Essex, who stages a play of Richard II and is judicially executed afterwards because drama is a political act and he shouldn't have done that, which is back to Rowland Hill and his statecraft through drama. We can see it in another setting. The link here is that the second Earl of Essex is educated by a man called Reverend Thomas Ashton. Reverend Thomas Ashton is known to be associated with Roger Ascham, who's a fellow of St. John's, Cambridge. They both are. Reverend Thomas Ashton is a foundational headmaster of Shrewsbury School. Shrewsbury School has a petitioner founder for the creation of that school, who is Rowland Hill. So the Hill engine of cultural things includes the person who's educating this individual. So we can see his use of drama and statecraft. And Shrewsbury School is actually quite famous in the 16th century for staging plays, to the extent that Elizabeth I is on her way there to watch a play of Ashton's. And Shrewsbury's festival is kind of analogous to our sense of what the Edinburgh Festival Fringe is now. It's a kind of a resort town that is doing drama that is sucking in people from the whole country. And that school is educating a number of other important Elizabethan statesmen, including Philip Sidney, who we come to on this slide. So the premiere of As You Like It is thought to potentially have been at Wilton House in 1599. The mistress of Wilton House, the wife of the Earl of Pembroke, is Mary Sidney, whose brother Philip went to Shrewsbury School, as de Vaux did. But importantly, given how the play goes, there is a moment where, when harmony is restored in As You Like It, the Duke says, going to mess this up slightly, first let us complete those ends that were well begun and well begot, and then every one of our number who has endured shrewd days and nights in us shall enjoy the fortunes of our returned fortune. The Pembrokes were thrown out of Wilton House during the Catholic period of the Reformation, and then they get the keys back to their house. So a play where you say these things and it is going to trigger a sense of the trauma of the Reformation, which allows me to underline my point that the play is dealing with political themes. But you have a member of the Sidney family whose father was a colleague of Rowland Hill's on the Council of the Marches, involved in the commissioning of this play. Now, the Earls of Southampton, the third Earl of Southampton is said by many scholars to be the inspiration for the sonnets. And the grandfather of the third Earl of Southampton is the first Earl. And Rowland Hill is recorded as being an intimate, private, family guest at the committal of the body of his Privy Councillor colleague, the first Earl. So there's a state element of 16th century funerals, and then there's a much more intimate private element, and Rowland Hill is included as a personal guest of the family there. So by the time you get to the grandson of that person, when you say Old Sir Rowland, in his sense, as a known Shakespeare muse and patron, you say the words Old Sir Rowland, and you go, oh, that person who attended my grandfather's funeral, intimate friend of my family. Stanley dynasty is on the slide there, and I need to cover that briefly. The Strangers' Men is run by Ferdinando, who's an Earl of Derby. There are monuments to the Stanley family, including a cousin of his, Thomas, in St. Bartholomew's Church in Tong in Shropshire. These monuments have epitaphs on them that are attributed to William Shakespeare. And the orbit of that, on a kind of ecclesiastical footing, is that Hodnet, the parish I am from, is closely associated with Tong, to the extent that the font, which shows knowledge of some of these classical allusions, was moved. It's a very fine font, an exquisite piece of art, but it is moved from Tong to Hodnet. But we have Shakespeare monuments to that family and an intimate connection with the same church that Rowland Hill was attending. Which brings me to the Vernon family. Rowland Hill is baptized in Hodnet Church. George Vernon of that family is baptized around the same time in the same church. He is a patriarch of a couple of generations down where there are Vernons who marry repeatedly into this smart set. They're like the Mitford sisters, and some scholars say that Elizabeth Vernon, who marries the Earl of Southampton, is the inspiration for Juliet in Romeo and Juliet, which puts that another play in the landscape I'm from. A lot of this is like serious scholarship, and it's a discipline, and it's a huge amount of respect, but a lot of people like to see receipts, which I have. And it's enough for me to be able to make my case out that As You Like It is at Soulton Hall and Rowland Hill is being invoked by what I will do in the first section of what I'm going to set out. But we have documents for 2 bits of this. So it is well-settled scholarship that this book that I'm holding now, by Thomas Lodge, who I will say junior, this book, Rosalind, is the source for As You Like It. It is called Rosalind. I got a hard copy of this not that long ago, and I read the description of the landscape. It describes a flat plain bounded by mountains, which is exactly the landscape I live in. But we can do rather better than that, because on the slide behind me, you are being shown a document anyone can call up in the county archive in Shropshire, deposited by my grandfather in the 1960s, called the Sutton Rental. There are 2 signatures circled on there. On the left is Rowland Hill's signature, and on the right is Thomas Lodge's signature. That is Thomas Lodge Sr. So the writer of the source book of As You Like It owned Soulton Hall prior to its transfer to Rowland Hill. So the boyhood of the writer of this book, Rosalind, is intimately connected with the woodland landscape of Soulton Hall, which is a forest setting in the Forest of Arden owned by Roland, who he knows because he's living in their old house. Then I got my schoolboy copy of this and realized that Thomas Lodge Jr. wrote the book, and I couldn't remember why I knew that name, and then I found the deeds of the house, and here we all are today. The Dance of 8 is complete at this point, and that's potentially enough. There's a quote on the screen. It says, "Peace ho, I bar confusion. 'Tis I must make conclusion of these most strange events. Here's 8 that must take hands to join in Hymen's bands, if truth holds to content." And then we can remember that we're in a building that is Wren's building in a 55-foot cube with a 8-pointed star outside. So sometimes this has been fairly elite knowledge that hasn't been widely shared, but it is all over London. If you go to Mansion House, there are 8-pointed, 8-fold symmetry roses everywhere, of underlying how important they are. Go to the British Museum, you're seeing the same motif. Go to Eleusis. And as I've said, for reasons that are covered in other lectures and future materials, this is talking about a harmonious society, which is what Rowland Hill achieved for the people that came after him. And the dance talks in really crude terms about showing up, because if only 7 people are there, you can't do it, which is a perspective on our culture that we live in now. If people aren't participating, it won't work. You need to target harmony and do it in good faith and recognize it's a team effort. And as a learning perspective, that's what Rowland Hill is talking about. That's what the dance is talking about. So if you accept that that is what this dance is talking about, it would be great if we could recover that, wouldn't it? And I've told you that the pavement at Soulton includes choreographic notation. We've been doing historical excavations, archaeological excavations, for the last 5 years, which means we have to do outreach. And here is a chalk drawing of the dance being done by some school children, the first recorded time of it coming back, right? So we drew a scale version, and then we just played the music, which we think we have from the dancing master of the 18th century, and then we just said, do it. This is the first slide I'm showing you of the dancing pavement at Soulton. That's put in by my 6 times great-grandmother. I had the book she designed in it. It's quite clearly doing mathematical harmony. It was in an exhibition in Shrewsbury to celebrate John Weaver and the point of origin of English ballet, which is in Shropshire. But this is incredibly important because it is the only known example in the world that we have been able to find of the notation. And if you count up the number of different coloured stones, you can see it's showing you how many times you do-si-do, that you go in the middle, and we're fairly clear that they clap. Now, here's where material culture starts to make my point and the pace picks up a little bit. Rowland Hill's chair has survived and come down to us. It is still in Soulton Hall, and as far as we know, it has never left in nearly 500 years. The slide shows you the back cloth with the dance as it appears at Soulton Hall in the dancing pavement, and Rowland Hill's chair of estate, or throne, if you want to call it that. This shows more knowledge of Eleusis, by the way, because the Eleusinian mysteries have 3 emblems. An 8-fold symmetry rose, which we have talked about, canisters, which you can see on the risers of the chair, on the arms and for the legs, and then there is wheat in it. So if you look at the top image, you can see chevrons, which is an artistic way of representing wheat. So the Eleusinian mysteries are in this chair, and we know Rowland Hill knows about it because he's measured the Eleusinian telestrion, and he's built his house to do that. But this chair is further proof of that. But the next image on here is from the first folio. Let's have a look at the book plate that appears after As You Like It. There is a circle in the center of it, and it's segmented into 8. And this is an artistic reference in the published material culture of As You Like It when Jaggers is publishing it, who, I learned from a dinner in Oxford on Tuesday, has got Rowland Hill's printing stamp from one of the books I was talking about. He has a half eagle and key printing stamp used on the Laws of Geneva, which is another thing that Rowland Hill published. But we can see this in about 4 movements of people. So Rowland Hill, as a publisher, is still connected to the work of publishing the folio, which I think is an uncontroversial thing to say, is an act of statecraft to teach about what England is, what it shouldn't do, what it might want to try and do. The history plays are warnings and encouragement. The comedies, As You Like It, is not a knockabout light play. It is talking about harmony in statecraft. And let's set Rowland Hill's chair, the dancing pavement, the folio bookplate I'm showing you together, the material documents I have shown you. The dance is preserved, and it is actually an invitation to continue it into our present time. So those points about team effort, showing up, acting with grace to target harmony, that's what Rowland Hill did. That's what he's asking us to still do. And when he picked up those messages, they weren't messages that he had conjured himself. They go back, as James's work will show, to the 6th century BC, well, 6,000 years ago in Persia. And it's in a Shakespeare play. And I defy you to walk around London and not see it now. Which is bringing me to the suggestion that there's a hostelry over there and a pavement between us with an 8-pointed star. So I hope when you look at that pavement, you will feel differently about it. End.